I'll play the part. After all, what is a drama without a villain? This business is not for the weak of heart. It is a thorny, brutal affair that rewards the lion for his ferocity. What of the zebra? What of the poor zebra? Well, the zebra is eaten as the zebra should be. Make no mistake, blood will be spilt. Lives will be lost. Fortunes will be made, and men will be ruined. There will be betrayal and scandal and perfidy of epic proportions. But the lion shall prevail. You see, the secret I know is this. All of history is driven by the lion. We drag the poor zebra, kicking and braying, staining the earth with his cheap blood. History doesn't remember us fondly. But then history is written by the zebra for the zebra. I will be remembered as a caitiff, a malefactor, who only operated out of greed for personal gain. All true. All true.
And now, our feature presentation.
Alright, welcome back to Honored Madman, and we're going to be talking about something Elder Scrolls related today. Specifically one of the more underrated races, or playable races that is, in the game series. I'm of course referring to the Orcs, or Orsimer as they're sometimes referred. They're considered mer, but generally are classified as beast folk or goblinkin by most of the provinces. They're actually one of the two changed races of Tamriel, the others being the Dunmer, who were once the Chimer. The Orcs change has been subject of some debate, I guess, but there is a commonly accepted story behind it. See, they were originally the followers of an elven god named Trinimac. He was an elvish god, so you can imagine he was quite proud and sanctimonious, but according to legend, or at least the Dark Elves version of it, Trinimac and his followers would personally try to stop the exodus of the Chimer people by the prophet Veloth. He would even challenge the prophet's patron Boethia to a duel, though this would prove to be his fatal mistake, as Boethia would devour the elven god whole and shit him out into a realm of smoldering ash and choking air, where he would begin to change into something else, and that something else turned out to be a Daedric prince named Malacath, and that choking pit of ash would act as his very own personal plane of Oblivion. And for whatever reason, this also transformed his followers and worshippers into, well, the Orcs we see today. Now, the Orcs tell a slightly different story about the duel between Boethia and Trinimac, saying that Trinimac was just about to win when Mephala appeared, Boethia's sister, and stabbed him in the back. Could this be some kind of cope to preserve the badassery of their patron saint? I suppose it's possible, but it also is in character for Mephala and Boethia to be working hand in hand, and we already know Azura had a hand in the prophet Veloth deciding to migrate him and his people, the Chimer, to Morrowind. So to me it lines up both with the Dunmer beliefs and the actions and natures of their gods, the quote-unquote good Daedra. There's also a really romanticized, colorful version of the story that claims that Boethia appeared as a beautiful young woman and asked Trinimac for a kiss, and when he obliged, Boethia ate him whole. And just as Trinimac's priests were preparing to pass judgment on all the Velothi dissidents, for attempting to migrate to Morrowind, although at the time it was called Resdayn. But before judgment could be passed, Boethia would suddenly appear, having taken on the form of Trinimac, fooling all of the priests in attendance. Boethia then proceeded to make a complete fool out of Trinimac by talking stupidly, farting, burping, just all around being a mess, so as to gather a large enough crowd. And when the crowd grew large enough, he told them all what the prophet Veloth had learned, and then demonstrated the lies of all of Trinimac's teachings in Trinimac's own voice. It was a pretty based moment, because Trinimac, like all Ultimate gods, was way too proud for his own good, thought he was better than everybody. He deserved to be shamed like this. And after all this, after Boethia had ensured that they were adequately broken and shamed, Boethia would then take a big ol' S, a shit, in front of the whole crowd, and that the piece of dung excreted by this Daedra Lord was proof of Trinimac's lies, and then cast him into what would become the Ash Pit. Now, some of these not so friendly towards the Orc accounts also claim that followers of both Boethia and Trinimac were said to have rubbed this dung on themselves and changed their skins, and that's supposedly why Orcs look so different than the other elves nowadays. Clearly elvish propaganda, even if it does depict Trinimac as having slunked off in his new half-crap, half-god form, on down to the Ash Pit where he fully transformed into Malacath, supposedly. I think that story is probably the most fun out of all of them. Now, Malacath himself considered the story to be propaganda and way too literal-minded. There's also some orcs out there who believe that Trinimac is still alive and that Malacath himself is a liar. These orcs usually revere Trinimac instead of Malacath, and a famous example would be King Gortwog, who built the third iteration of Orsinium in the Third Era. It's also worth mentioning that there's a good number of inconsistencies with both of these stories of the Orcish creation. Some accounts of the story claim that Trinimac's duel with Boethia happened in the Dawn Era. Now that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because the prophet Velos' exodus to Morrowind took place during the Merithic Era, which predates the Dawn Era. Not to mention Orcish oral tradition states that there were 13 Orcish strongholds in the Rothgarian Mountains in the Dawn Era. There's also plenty of accounts of explorers claiming to have seen orcs way before the Aldemir even set foot on Tamriel, possibly indicating that this story was a lie and that orcs have always been around, or that there's two separate, unrelated groups of orcs running around on Tamriel now. This could be viewed as possible evidence that the story of their supposed creation is a lie, and that perhaps Malacath has been using this information or the story to string them along so that he could at least have one whole race of people that reveres him. And maybe it's the truth, maybe it's a lie. But why orcs worship Malacath doesn't necessarily revolve around him being their savior or patron saint. It comes from them viewing him as a kindred spirit, as he's considered an outcast among the Daedra Lords, which could be because he might possibly be a former divine, or Aedra, one that had been transformed and corrupted by an extremely powerful Daedra Lord into, well, something else. And because of that, Malacath is despised, hated, made fun of, and misunderstood by all the other Daedra Lords, which mirrors how the Orcs were created and were treated by the other races of Tamriel. Most orcs view him as their patron god simply because he's the most famous outcast god, well, besides Lorcan, that is. Now, despite what I've said or might say in this video, I do think Malacath does genuinely care about the orcs. He may not directly intervene on their behalf like we see him do with the ogres, and one might argue that that could be because the orcs are a far more intelligent and sophisticated race than the ogres, and that perhaps Malacath expects more from them and wants them to be better themselves and solve their own problems themselves. All in adherence to his code though, the unwritten code of Malacath that the stronghold orcs live by. The rules themselves seem to function more as guidelines anyway. They can be interpreted however the acting chieftain wants them to be interpreted, although I imagine the core tenets aren't changed. The thing is though, is that Malacath can sometimes be quite the vengeful god towards the orcs. He's known to curse entire clans for the actions of one cowardly chieftain, which seems fucked, but at least it's not as bad as Azura. She uplifted a race of elves into a higher state of being just because they listened to her, and then when 3 individuals did something she didn't like, she cursed the entire race to become dark elves because of it, when previously they'd had golden skin while they were the Chimer, or however you say that word. And it's funny that the very same dark elves view Azura as good and Malacath as bad. But I'm not entirely sold on the idea that the Orcish race was created because an elven god was swallowed whole and transformed. I do think that the Orcs existed before this supposed creation of Malacath. But he does appear to want the best for his people. He just has his own way of doing it. And I mean, if he really is a transformed Aldemir god, it's no real surprise he's so backwards in how he shows love to his favored people. Malacath's biggest problem seems to be his stupidity, and maybe he's not as stupid as the other Daedra princes make him out to be, but there was that time Sheogorath supposedly tricked him into killing his own demigod son and dooming him to the mad god's realm of the Shivering Isles. Not exactly a shining moment for Malacath or anybody related to him, honestly. But that doesn't mean Malacath doesn't have his own way of doing good as well. At one point, he even had the protagonist of a game hunt down the descendant of a famous dark elven hero and kill him because his ancestor took credits for the actions of his orcish buddy. And the Helm of Harain Bearclaw Malacath would claim for himself, similar to what he did with Valendrung. That's another thing. Malacath doesn't really have any of his own artifacts, he just has ones that he gets and claims. But I'm getting off topic already. Now, at the end of the day, I guess it doesn't matter if the orcs really are changed elves, or if they're distant, more intelligent cousins to goblins and ogres. What mattered was that they were now here, and there was nothing the other races could do about it, no matter how hard they tried. Now, the Dunmer may have patented slavery, but they sure didn't found it. That would be the Orsimer, or High Elves, who would mistake the orcs for some type of goblin kin, and enslave a great number of them alongside goblins, ogres, and other beastfolk races like the Argonians and Khajiits. And while countless orcs were enslaved, there were still countless clans that were not. The early orcs spent most of the first era attempting to carve out any land they could hold and occupy. Now, since the beginning, most of the orcish territory has been confined to the Hrothgarian Mountains, which themselves are located in between High Rock and Hammerfell. As time progressed, they added to their little bit of territory by taking little pieces of High Rock, which would have earned them the ire of the Bretons if they would have just stopped fighting each other and looked up for once. They also settled in the extremely harsh Dragontail Mountains that were located in Hammerfell, and I can't imagine the Redguards were cool with this, but they probably didn't really mind it that much since there weren't that many Redguards living in those mountains either. But as the orcs were gradually adding to their territory, something unexpected would happen. The Cameron dynasty of kings who ruled over the Aldmer would free all of their beastfolk slaves, including the orcs, many of which chose to flee into High Rock after being allowed to settle north of Valenwood, where a number of orcs would choose to remain, and eventually they would turn into the Wood Orcs over time. Their numbers were greatly bolstered by the freeing of all those slaves, but they still had no province of their own to call home. Meanwhile, several orc clans were content to live inside the Hrothgarian Mountains. They became something like a group of subterranean cave orcs. Around this time, the first Orsinium was built in the very same mountains, and while they finally had a kingdom to call their own, many orcs would spread across the continent to settle elsewhere. Perhaps it's that natural adventurous spirit that all orcs possess. Either that, or Orsinium wasn't really that big, and there were a lot of orcs. Not to mention the constant pressure they faced from the other races of Tamriel. But unfortunately for the orcs, the worst was yet to come. Luckily though, by this point they had safely established themselves in places as far as Skyrim, where they clashed with the ancestors of the Nords, the Atmorans, Morrowind, where they would once again clash with the Chimer, which was what the Dunmer were before Azura cursed them all to have dark skin. Those orcs would become the Malak orcs. They controlled a stretch of highlands between Nibelheim and western Morrowind. These guys would turn out to be extremely hostile down the road, and were worshippers of the god Moloch, who people can't seem to decide if he was just another version of Malacath or a different god altogether. And a great number of orcs would choose to settle in Valenwood. Those particular orcs over time became their own sub-race within a race called the Wood Orcs. See, the Wood Elf religion forbade the Bosmer from chopping down trees unless they planned to eat them. The Wood Orcs were not beholden to these religious laws and were able to chop down trees and sell lumber to the Wood Elves, who were then able to build forts and houses out of them. Now, they managed to establish themselves in all these other provinces, but they never had one to call their own. Yeah, they had Orsinium, but that was basically just a city and a castle in the middle of some pretty unforgiving mountain ranges. Some orc clans would choose to settle in Hammerfell amongst some of the Needs. That is, until the Redguards and the Ragada arrived from Yakuta and systematically slaughtered all the Needs and drove the orcs out of the area so they could properly set up shop. The fleeing orcish clans were led by a warlord named Tholgeg, who attempted to cut a path through the Alakir Desert and find safe haven in High Rock. But once again, unfortunately for the orcs, they were denied entry into High Rock by the Bretons, and they were instead forced to flee northeast through the extremely unforgiving Dragontail mountain range until they finally reached their home, Orsinium. Now, the orcs were understandably pretty pissed after this point, so understandably they began to frequently raid human settlements as a sort of retribution for how they'd been denied to settle just about everywhere for basically no reason, just because they were green and the Redguards and Bretons considered them beast folk. Malacath, being the prick that he is, was disgusted by what he considered to be their subversive and dishonorable actions, so he did the only thing reasonable for the weakest of all the Daedra princes and abandoned his own people. which, side note, to me, adds more fuel to the fire of Malacath not really caring that much about the orcs unless they follow his way of living. It's not hard to see why some orcs view Malacath to be a liar, someone who manipulated the orcs into being his followers because he was considered extremely weak by the other Daedra princes and had no army of followers at his disposal like they did. But yeah, end of side note. And for the rest of the First Era, the orcs' actions would continue to grow more and more aggressive. In many ways, they gave the Bretons and Redguards the monsters that they'd always viewed them as. I mean, how long were they supposed to just keep taking all the bullshit that the Redguards and Bretons were throwing at them? And while they were constantly viewed as savages and barbarians, one group of orcs actually managed to take over the whole Isle of Brittany, driving all the native Breton population off the island. They became known as the Seamount clan of orcs, and they held that island up until the Third Era. Mainly because at that point in the timeline, orcs have once again lost their citizenship, and the Bretons and Redguards were allowed to treat them as monstrous savages. You'll see it becomes a bit of a trend as we go on. At one point, the High King of Skyrim, Wulfharth, himself a time-traveling cyborg, at that point going by the title of Ash King, would make peace with the orcs, after both the Nords of Skyrim and the Orcish clans were invited to Red Mountain to join forces with the dwarves against the Dunmer in the Battle of Red Mountain, or as the elves call it, the War of the First Council. Now, the alliance between the Nords and the orcs was sort of unprecedented at the time. For years, the Nords had considered the orcs as territorial invaders, even though the orcs argued that they've been in Skyrim longer, and Wulfharth himself had long considered the orcish race as a whole to be enemies. But as we'll learn later, Wulfharth was actually a pretty cool character, and he understood that he would need to make strange allies in order to fully eradicate the elves. In this particular case, the Chimer, who he referred to as devils. It's no wonder the Ash King sought out a race of more traditional devils in order to aid him in his crusade. And who better than the orcs? I mean, this guy was willing to ally himself with the dwarves as well. You can see at the end of the day, he just really hated the Chimer. Now, it's believed that some of these orcs from this campaign chose to remain in the ranges in between Cyrodiil and Morrowind, eventually becoming a separate culture from the orcs as a whole known as the Malak Orcs, who were said to be savage, giant, and extremely dangerous. Now, towards the end of the First Era, things weren't looking so great for the orcs. By this point, they had long been forsaken by their patron god Malacath, and the frequent raids and attacks on human settlements had made them into a bigger enemy than they already were in the eyes of the Redguards and the Bretons. So near the close of the First Era, the assuredly stained-toothed king of Daggerfall, himself a scheming political manipulator, would use the increasing hostilities between humans and orcs as an excuse to finally make a play for their lands. Never mind that the Redguards and Bretons had pushed the orcs to be this way. I mean, what were they supposed to do? Just keep getting battered around and displaced by the various other cultures they came into contact with? This treacherous king of Daggerfall would get his wish and form an alliance with Sentinel, the capital of Hammerfell, and the famous Order of Diagna. Now, this all came about because a certain orcish king named Golkar laid claim to the Breton kingdom of Stormhaven, at the same time calling to arms all the orcs in the region to come join his cause. King Golkar's goal in claiming this kingdom had an ulterior motive. He planned to capture a certain river to force the kingdom of Wayrest to provide compensation for its use, which was something the Bretons could not abide. Unfortunately for the orcs, this made the Bretons of the contested land rather unsurprisingly join up with King Joil of Daggerfall's army. And it was around this time that certain Daggerfall king sent his message to Hammerfell and allied himself with the Order of Diagna and Gaiden Shinji. And this newly formed alliance would begin its 30-year invasion of the orcish homeland. However, the orcs, as they always do, put up way more of a fight than was ever expected of their invaders. Orcs were no stranger to having to endure an ungodly amount of pressure. In fact, the only reason the city ever fell was because of treachery. At one point during the siege, King Golkar pleaded for the assistance of Baloth Bloodtusk, an orcish hero and the leader of an order known as the Savage Sons, in many ways Gaiden Shinji's orcish counterpart. In many ways, Bloodtusk embodied what it meant to be an orc, a true individual and outcast. He continued to worship Malacath even though all of his kinsmen believed themselves forsaken by him. He was strong, an excellent combatant, and presumably quite a good leader. It can also be said that he was surprisingly reasonable for an orc. He served no causes blindly, and his reasons were always his own. He led a group of highly skilled warriors, the Savage Sons, making him a bit like an orcish Beowulf. He served no king, only fighting causes he believed in, and swore loyalty to no man, or orc for that matter. As a devout follower of Malacath, he had long condemned the city of Orsinium to its fall, believing that Orsinium and Golkar himself pretty much brought on this war they were now fighting, claiming that they were more than responsible for provoking it, and refused to aid King Golkar. Well, that is until King Joel hatched yet another scheme, this time having his savage Reachman general kidnap the brother of Baloth Bloodtusk, and faked his death to draw Baloth into the war, presumably thinking this must be a good enough reason to get the Bloodtusk to enter the fight. And it did work, but I don't think they expected him to be as big of a problem for them as he ended up being, which I think says a lot about Baloth. They had to force him to join a war he wanted no part in for personal reasons. According to legend, several years into the siege, King Golkar was praying at a monument to Malacath at the Grudgment Hall when he was assassinated by the King of Daggerfall and Gaiden Shinji. Now, no one knows if this is true, but the king did die. However, this did not end the siege of Orsinium. Baloth Bloodtusk now became the face of the Orcish resistance in Orsinium, and the siege would continue for a number of years. Until, well, for lack of a better word, some treacherous ass shit happened. Allow me to explain. The Savage Sons reinforced the city, and the siege would go on for a good number of years, with both sides incurring heavy losses and finally coming to the agreement that maybe this siege has gone on a little too long. So at this point, King Joel was pretty frustrated that all his scheming had amounted to was essentially an unwinnable war against an enemy that didn't know the word surrender. So he devised a plan to finally get this show on the road. He decided the best way to settle this stalemate was a duel fought between the greatest champion of each sides of the conflict. In this case, Gaiden Shinji of the Order of Diagna, fighting for the Bretons and Redguards, and Baloth Bloodtusk of the Savage Sons, who of course fought for Orsinium. And since both sides wanted to see a quick end to this conflict as soon as possible, they agreed that the winner of the duel would get Orsinium. And both of these guys were like the greatest warriors of their generation, so it's not surprising that the two warriors themselves probably wanted to see who was stronger of the two. From the information I can find about them, they actually seemed like pretty similar dudes. Except for the fact that Baloth Bloodtusk fought for whoever he wanted, and Gaiden Shinji unfortunately was manipulated into this whole thing by a Breton king. Anyway, though, the duel was to be fought in Orsinium, and many members of the Savage Sons and the Order of Diagna were in attendance. Now, the two fought their duel for quite a long time, presumably evenly matched. They even did that classic thing where they gained a mutual respect for one another during the fight. However, once again, unfortunately for the Orcs, in the middle of the battle, King Joel ordered his Reachman general to order her archers to open fire on Gaiden Shinji and Baloth Bloodtusk and their respective armies. It had taken him many years to do it, but Joel finally revealed his treachery. He had always planned to betray the Red Guards after he'd used them to dull their blades against the Orcs. Now, in the resulting confusion, Orsinium still managed to not fall, and the savage Reachman General Mercedine would be killed before she could escape the city. Joel, on the other hand, would manage to escape Orsinium and would begin a conquest of Hammerfell soon after, but he would be killed before he ever got any success in that department. Meanwhile, Gaiden Shinji and Baloth Bloodtusk were buried in a special mausoleum built by Gaiden Shinji's friend Tristan and Baloth Bloodtusk's brother Kuzog, called Honor's Rest in Hrothgar, honoring the final wishes of Shinji, who wished to be buried in the land that he fell in, to honor the opponent of his final fight, in this case Baloth. Sometime later, the siege of Orsinium would finally end in the 980th year of the First Era, when its defenses were finally breached and the city itself was razed to the ground by the allied army that had been besieging it for 30 years. Now, Orsinium may have finally fallen, but that was not the end for the Orcs. They once again scattered across the Hrothgar and Dragontail mountain ranges, while never letting the dream of an Orcish homeland die. And true to the Orcs' nature, Orsinium was eventually rebuilt, either before the close of the First Era or in the early years of the Second, and it was officially recognized as a territory of the Second Empire during the rule of the Akaviri potentate Verisidue Shai, a literal blood-drinking snake man that inherited the empire after Emperor Raymond's mysterious death at the close of the First Era. And during that time, a large fort was constructed called Frostbreak Fortress, with the purpose of defending Orsinium against any potential sieges. Now, since these Snake Man emperors were long-lived vampire types, they ruled for about 400 or so years, and during this time the Orcs enjoyed a status as citizens of the Empire for the first time. I'm sure all the old prejudices still lingered, especially when it came to the Bretons, and I imagine the average Orc was treated with some level of distrust, similar to how the Dunmer were treated, or the other beast folk for that matter. But there was this shaky period of time where they were actually official citizens of the Empire. Now, unfortunately, this would all abruptly end in the 430th year of the Second Era, when the son of the original Akaviri potentate Snake Man was famously assassinated by the Morag Tong, roughly 106 years into his reign. Now, side note, I've kind of slandered the Akaviri a little bit, but Versidu Shea's son, Savrian Shorak, the guy who was assassinated by the Morag Tong, is also responsible for the founding of the Fighters Guild. Granted, that was because both him and his father's rules were plagued with long periods of internal strife. It's not all that surprising he wound up assassinated. They also killed his heirs too. One of them almost managed to escape. Anyway, though, I'm getting off subject. How did all of this affect the Orcs? Well, with what looked to be the collapse of the Empire, they lost their legitimacy, and to the surprise of absolutely no one, the Bretons seized this opportunity to once again sack Orsinium, literally within a year of the Empire's collapse. It's almost like they were waiting for this opportunity. Especially when you consider the fact that destroying Orsinium just wasn't enough for the Bretons this time, seizing all of the surrounding land of Orsinium and forcing the Orcs to, yet again, flee into their protected mountain range of Hrothgar and scatter across all of northern Tamriel. I think I mentioned earlier that some of them wound up as far as the borders in between Cyrodiil and Morrowind. Those particular Orcs were said to be very savage and very large. Now others set out for Skyrim to reassert old territorial claims with the Nord holdings there. Most notably a chief Yashnag Groyazgu, who managed to carve out a pretty large claim in western Falkreath, probably most of the hold, and he managed to rule that particular piece of land for a good 30 plus years, until he was killed by a Nord named Hackvild, who was foreverforth known as Hackvild Yashnag Slayer. I mean, say what you want about the Nords, and they have pretty good naming schemes, don't they? Now, until ESO, that was pretty much all we knew about what happened with the Orcs during the Second Era. But now we know the part they played in this famous Covenant War. So when two Breton kings that were fighting amongst themselves, as they often do, one of them sent emissaries into the mountains of Hrothgar asking for help, basically saying, hey, if you show up and help me defeat my enemy, I will give you back Orsinium. Now it's said that initially only one clan answered this call, and that was the one of Chief Kurog Grobagrak, who showed up and completely decimated the enemy king's forces when they were on retreat. Now after this, a second Orsinium was founded and the Daggerfall Covenant was formed, between the races of the Redguards, Bretons, and Orcs. Now King Kurog didn't trust the representatives of either of these races as far as he could throw them, just given the long list of atrocities the Redguards and Bretons had committed against the Orcish people. He had one condition on joining the Covenant, and that was that no army from Hammerfell or High Rock would ever enter Hrothgar under any circumstances. So King Kurog's Orsinium was built into different locations in the mountains of eastern Hrothgar near the border of Skyrim, while the abandoned ruins of the old ruined city became known as Old Orsinium. King Kurog would also put out an open invitation to all the strongest warriors of the land to come help him build a stronger, united Orcish kingdom. Now, unfortunately for the king, his rule was plagued by having to deal with the constant squabbles of the warring clans he was trying to keep united. There were countless clans that chose to revere Trinimac as a separate god from Malacath and viewed Malacath as a liar, while the old Orcish fundamentalists argued that Malacath was their true god and protector and that what the Trinimac worshippers were saying was blasphemy. Now all this strife was actually orchestrated by Kurog's own mother, Alga, and Kurog himself would slowly become corrupted by his mother's political scheming, and himself would orchestrate a massacre at a temple of Trinimac at the hands of Malacath worshippers, pinning the blame on his own political rival in the process, while at the same time ordering a cult of Trinimac that his mother had founded to actually attack the stronghold of this political rival he had just framed and imprison him. He also paid the protagonist of ESO to convince a couple of the chiefs of some of the warring clans to attend a moot, also he could kill them once they showed up. Now, since the protagonist wasn't a tool, he actually learned of Kurog's treachery and sided against him with his political rival, the one that he imprisoned, an orc named Bazrag Grofarin, the chief of the Malacath worshipping tribe that he had his mother's death squad of Trinimac worshipping lunatics kidnap. And the two of them managed to actually save some of the orc chiefs and killed King Kurog and his mom Alga. When the dust settled, Bazrag was crowned the new king of Orsinium and promised to continue working towards Kurogg's original dream before he was all corrupted. And that was a dream of a united orc people equal to the other races, while also trying to keep the peace and not force his vision or his will upon anyone or any of the other races, like what had been done to his people by the Redguards and the Bretons. Bazrag even considered leaving the Daggerfall Covenant because he wasn't the one who agreed to it. That was Kurogg's choice, and we don't really know if a decision was ever reached. But aside from all that, the Second Era was also the time two of the most long-lived Orcish mages were born in. gra-kogg, librarian of the Arcanium in the College of Winterhold, who's supposedly been keeping his collection and building it since, as he puts it, before the Third Era. Now maybe he's even older, I don't know, but it seems safe to date him as being born in the Second Era. And the other was gra-kogg, a very famous Orcish mage and former member of the Psijic Order. She was born roughly 3 centuries prior to the time we meet her in ESO and was still around in the Third Era to debate against the inept archmage Hannibal Traven over the ethics of necromancy late into the Third Era. And while she's the only Orcish Psijic that we've met across all these games, I don't think she's the only one that exists, as she herself even implies that there's been others. And same with Orcish mages. There are probably several other long-lived Orcish mages too, but those are the only 2 I know as probably being from the Second Era. They just felt worth mentioning as there aren't very many long-lived orcs, at least on their level. And you'd think that since orcs were considered mer, elvish, that they'd have long lifespans. But they don't. Their lifespans are actually closer to that of a human or one of the other beast races. And I suppose this could be evidence of the orcs not actually being mer. Where are their merish lifespans? Maybe they are just goblin kin. But the Nords do have a myth about why the orcs don't live as long as their supposed other elvish cousins. But I'd take this with a grain of salt, as it comes from the Nords and they do have a flair for the dramatic, especially when it comes to glorifying their own race, or the gods they worship. So the Nords believe that long ago a god called Orki, which itself is an amalgamation of Arche and Malacath, that served as an obscure Nordic god of death, cursed the Nords to only have a lifespan of 6 years, effectively dooming the race as a whole. But supposedly, according to the legend, the Nordic god Shor showed up and threw the curse onto the nearby Orcs, effectively damning them to the lifespan of a man while they deserved the lifespan of an elf. Now, scholars have dug even deeper into this myth and uncovered a more detailed account that claims that Orki summoned Alduin, who proceeded to use his freaky-deaky time magic to turn every Nord into a 6-year-old. But since this happened during the time of Wulfharth, the legendary Nordic High King and future one-half of the Underking, who had also been turned into a boy by this magic, begged his patron god Shor for help, who himself was the Nordic version of Shezar or Lorkhan, the famous missing divine and god of all mortals. And luckily the ancient trickster god answered Wulfharth's pleas and showed up in Force Ghost form to fight Alduin just like he did at the beginning of time. Wulfharth watched this battle as it played out in the skies above Skyrim, and from his observation he learned how to use the Thu'um to reverse the curse that had been placed on the Nords, and being the ancient demigod king that he was, actually pulled it off and reversed the curse, but doing so did in fact cost him his life. But he would show up a couple more times in history, so this wasn't the end of Wulfharth by a long shot. But yeah, that's how the Nords see it. Of course, it makes them look like the innocent victims and the victorious force that they always look like in most of their stories. But there could be some truth to it, as with most of these stories involving the battles of gods go. They're all just accounts of legends that have been handed down through the generations. No one who was actually there is still alive, even if it actually happened. And obviously there's no way to know if there's any truth to that, but it did feel like it was worth mentioning, because if it is true, in addition to all the other hardships the orcs have suffered, they've also had their deserved lifespans ripped from them due to the schemes of gods. Although I don't think the orcs themselves care much about what Nordic legend says about them. And if the story's bullshit, there's really no explanation for why the orcs have much shorter lifespans than the other elves, other than either them actually not being elves, or that their lifespan was shortened by some other means. Perhaps, if the myth of their creation is true, perhaps it was something that was taken out during their transformation into the Orsimer. But it's worth mentioning that the Chimer, who are also a changed race, they changed into the Dark Elves, they didn't lose their long lifespans after this whole racial transformation. A transformation that was also done by a Daedra Lord. So I don't think that's how the orcs lost it. I'm still not fully sold one way or the other if the orcs are elves or if they're just a really intelligent race of goblinkin, but it's always fun to speculate. And we also have to account for the fact that we don't really see too many old orcs, because orcish tradition dictates that the honorable thing to do before you become a burden to your tribe is to walk out into the wilderness and find a good death. And that's a big part of why we don't see elderly orcs. I mean, they don't like the idea of growing old and gray and weak. Now, obviously, not all orcs share this whole mindset. It's generally just the really devout of Malacath and like the stronghold orcs, but I do think it is a big part about why we don't see very many old orcs. So at some point in between the close of ESO's timeline and the beginning of the mainline game's timelines, the orcs would once again lose Orsinium, probably at the hands of the Bretons once again, or maybe the Red Guards helped just for old time's sake. But whatever happened, they once again lost the land and were living in the mountains. At this point, it had to be like the 4th time or 5th time it's happened to them. And they also were no longer recognized as a sentient species. This is sort of what happened to the Minotaurs too, where it was just arbitrarily decided that they aren't sentient species and are instead beast folk or monsters that needed to be exterminated. I mean, that's how orcs were pretty much portrayed in Arena. They were basically just bigger goblins. So yeah, the third era, like the eras before it, wasn't looking too good for the orcs. All the progress they'd made as a race had been effectively forgotten or ignored or just discarded by the other races. I mean, the orcs literally fought alongside the Bretons and the Red Guards during the Covenant War, and now they're just recognized as monsters? I mean, come on. I could easily blame the writing for that, but I'm sure it wouldn't have been hard to get the Bretons and the Red Guards to once again wage war on the orcs, given their long history of warfare against one another. But this never-ending series of hardships for the orcs was finally about to change. Enter Gortwog Gro-Nagorm, an orcish leader unlike any that preceded him. In the 399th year of the Third Era, Gortwog laid claim on the land that was once Orsinium, disputing the claim of its current landowner, a Breton lord, before an imperial judge. Now, the judge was actually a pretty decent guy and recognized Gortwog's claim as legitimate and determined that the only way to settle this was by a duel, one that could be fought either between the two claimants or by champions of their choosing. Gortwog, of course, would be fighting this duel himself, which was something that pressured the Breton lord to also fight in the duel himself, despite probably wanting to use a champion. The judge also determined that Gortwog would get to choose the gear and that the Breton lord would get to choose the place. Gortwog picked steel longswords and orcish armor, and the spiteful little Breton lord Bowen picked his cousin's arena in his castle of Wayrest, so that none of Gortwog's orcs could be in attendance. Bowen attempted to train for a week using orcish armor, but failed miserably no matter who his instructor was, until his cousin's old butler, an orc who once served in the Cursed Legion of High Rock, was brought on to teach him how to fight in orcish armor. Now, under this old orc's training, he actually got kinda good. Now, they trained hard for 2 days, but then Bowen attended his cousin's wedding, and in what could only be described as a George R.R. Martin style food description, they gorged themselves with fine food and alcohol. Now, after he was done eating, Bowen happened to notice that Gortwog was here, accompanied by the very same imperial judge from their hearing. Now, at first it might seem like some treachery was happening here, but Bowen's cousin explained that his old orc mentor had basically suggested that they move the duel to tonight, and that he would never fight better than he would right now. Now, he was surprised when he was actually able to move quite well in the armor given his enlarged state, and the duel itself lasted 3 hours before they called it. Bowen lost, of course, but since the duel had happened so abruptly, he didn't get embarrassed in front of all of his friends like he feared, but he happened to notice his old orc mentor talking to Gortwog after the duel, and when he went to question the old orc about it, he admitted that he wanted Gortwog to win, but he didn't want it to be won easily, and that's why he moved the fight to tonight because, well, he expected that he wouldn't be able to ever fight as good as he would on that night. He basically filled him up with food to make him as heavy as an orc so that moving in the armor would actually be easy, and so that Gortwog would actually have to work for his victory. Now that was all covered in How Orsinium Passed to the Orcs, a great read. And after this, Gortwog had a new Orsinium created, and it was named Nova Orsinium, which was built at the site of the first iteration of the city, over the ruins of Old Orsinium. He kept the name Orsinium to honor the land of his forefathers and all they had fought for in the past, which, as we've covered, is quite a bit. and he fully understood that building this city with statues of famous orc heroes and orcish gods would likely provoke the same reactions that its previous iterations had. So he knew he had to tread carefully. He had to forge alliances, he had to lie, he had to blackmail, he had to scheme if he wanted sovereign recognized rule over Orsinium, especially in High Rock. And that was just the first hurdle, because after that, after he was recognized by High Rock, he would have to be recognized by the Empire. So yeah, he had a lot on his plate, and Gortwog himself would prove to be one of the best leaders the Orcs ever had. A somewhat rarity for one of his race, he proved to be an adept political manipulator, skilled at blackmail, espionage, poison, subterfuge. Perhaps he learned a thing or two from the Bretons, which makes sense because there's a couple lore sources that seem to indicate that Gortwog had the blood of Tiber Septim, who was a Breton, by the way. Don't believe all the Nord propaganda, which if true makes him a bastard of the Septim line, which to me makes some of his actions a bit more curious. For example, at one point he even came into possession of one of the suppressed copies of a chapter of a little book I just covered called The Real Berenzia, something that would cause great embarrassment to the King of Wayrest as he was currently married to her, as well as the Septim family, because the chapter in question involved a deeply detailed account of Tiber Septim's relationship with Berenzia that alleged that she became pregnant after the affair and that he had the kid aborted. Ironically, this is something that wasn't edited out of the censored version that came out a couple decades later. Apparently that passage wasn't so offensive after all, or at least it paled in comparison to the one with her and the cat with the barbed dong. And Gortwog acquired this probably so he could threaten to have it published if he ever came into conflict with the Kingdom of Wayrest, or if he ever needed anything from them. And you gotta hand it to him, he's probably the only reason that that particular chapter saw the light of day. He also came into possession of a very valuable letter that was addressed to the Queen of Daggerfall after it had been stolen by the Thieves Guild. He then sold various copies of the letter to some of the powers that were vying for control of Iliac Bay. He also helped lay King Lysandus to rest, the very same King of Daggerfall that had supported his claim towards Orsinium being sovereign. He was a dude who remembered his allies, that's for sure. And he knew how to play I hate saying it, but he knew how to play the Game of Thrones. Now, he also famously participated in the Warp of the West, a weird little event that made all the endings of Daggerfall canon. He proved himself to be both a fair man and an eloquent speaker with this letter he wrote to the protagonist of Daggerfall once they acquired the fabled Totem of Tiber Septim. I'll let the letter speak for itself because it's pretty good. You are not Orcish. How could you possibly understand what it is like? My people are treated like barbarians, slaughtered upon sight. Is it so unusual that we respond in kind? Violence begets violence. I aspire to raise my race from the mire. I will bring them to equal standing with the other races of Tamriel. To do this, I must have the Totem of Tiber Septim. I will not insult you by promises that no blood will be shed. I do swear by my crown and by my heirs that I shall not attempt to hold sway beyond the borders of Orsinium. My goal is not to conquer Tamriel, but to create an Orcish homeland. I am in possession of an artifact that I am sure you would want to possess. It is yours if you give me the Totem of Tiber Septim. Signed, Gortwog, Warlord and King. Now I think just from that letter you can see why he's such a great leader. He does not intend to exact vengeance for the atrocities his people have endured at the hands of the other races. He just wants an equal footing for his people. A place that they could call home without worrying that the Bretons or the Red Guards are going to come knocking and take it from them. Now, all the other 6 factions send the protagonist of Daggerfall a letter, but I always thought that Gortwog's was the most reasonable and understanding of the choices. Not saying some of the others don't have good causes too. The Underking does come to mind, finally laying him to rest and whatnot. But luckily, all of them got what they wanted during the Warp in the West, so it doesn't really matter who you choose. Now, what was this mysterious totem in question? Well, it was effectively a key of sorts for a WMD called the Numidium, a giant dwarven mechanical golem powered by the fused heart and soul of King Wolfhearth and battle mage Zurin Arctus. Yeah, we're getting convoluted. But when the dust of the Warp in the West settled, Orsinium was officially recognized as a kingdom by the Emperor, and from this point on, Orsinium was officially a recognized homeland and province for the Orcs. Now, it's technically just an independent kingdom inside High Rock that swears allegiance to the Empire, but their foot was officially in the door, and Gortwog himself would dedicate his life to gaining provincial status for Orsinium. Now, the Warp in the West is dated as having taken place in the 405th year of the Third Era, 6 years after the official founding of Orsinium as a city at the hands of King Gortwog. and over 400 years since the idea had first been proposed to Tiber Septim during the founding of the Empire. And though the Orcs of Iliac Bay and the surrounding kingdoms had long been viewed as enemies and villains, they were now official citizens of the Empire, whether the other races liked it or not. Iliac Bay in particular would settle into an almost unfounded peace for the first time. In time, Gortwog's Orsinium would form its own identity as a nation of the Empire, and it would essentially strive to set itself apart from the previous Orsiniums and all the failings of all the previous Orc leaders. This new Nova Orsinium was also viewed as quite welcoming to outsiders, and the necromancers who wrote Corpse Preparation even sent a delegation to seek asylum from Gortwog and his new nation, so that they could practice their ways safely there in exchange for the protection of the Orcs, who, according to the necromancers themselves, have the most sturdy and durable corpses of all the races. And I imagine the Orsinium Mages Guild must have been somewhat accepting of necromancers, given that their head, Alyssida gra-kogg, was a defender of the practical use of necromancy, and was actually chased from her guild hall because she still continued to practice it despite Archmage Traven's banning of it. She escaped, of course. I mean, what do you expect from a former member of the Psijic Order? Her replacement was presumably one of Traven's many cronies. We all know the level of favoritism he runs the guild with, but I'm getting off topic again. And over the next couple decades, the Orcs would fully integrate into the society of the Empire. This was mainly done through their enlistment into the Imperial Legion. We see by the events of Morrowind that there are a lot of Orcish legionaries. Some of them even bought a really dope mansion and are hanging out with a scamp down in the Imperial mining town of Caldera on Vardenfell. One of the coolest towns, I might add. During this time, Gortwog would also send out countless adventurers all across Tamriel to raid the decrepit and forgotten about dungeons and ruins of the land and bring back their riches to help build Orsinium into a true rich nation that could rival the other provinces. Some Orcish adventurers, whether affiliated with Gortwog or not, even went so far as to go through the door in Niben Bay that led to the Fringe of Madness. Now, there's no proof that those two particular adventurer leaders were affiliated with Gortwog, but I think the choice to make them Orcish is no coincidence, although they are the only Orcs in their respective adventuring parties, so perhaps they are just unaffiliated Orcish adventurers. Now, alongside the Orcs' prolific service to the Legion as smiths and soldiers, they're also pretty embedded into Cyrodiilic society as well. For example, the Count of Skingrad has an Orcish steward. There's an Orcish nobleman who has holdings in the Gerald Mountains near Cheydinhall. They also make up a pretty large part of the backbone of the Cyrodiilic Fighters Guild, and probably the Morrowind one too, and I imagine a great number of Orcs found fame at the arena as well. I think Coral's Countess also employs an Orc, so they definitely don't have trouble finding work out here. Shit, Cheydinhall even has an all-Orc gang that runs a drug smuggling operation with ties to the Kimona Tong in Morrowind. And also, on Vardenfell, there's a number of Daedric ruins occupied by gangs of Orcs, which I imagine are acting as makeshift strongholds. At least by the events of the game proper, a good amount of Orcs appear to be eking out an existence in Morrowind, the same as they are in Oblivion, just living as normal citizens. There's also a handful of Orcish magisters who are in charge of their own guild halls. Now, they were still met with the occasional distrust from strangers, but the Orcs themselves held no animosity towards the other races as a whole. At least in Oblivion, this was manifested as a 0% disposition change between all races. This was the only race that did this, as all the other races had their own racial biases towards one another. But not the Orcs. They viewed all as equal individuals, until the individual wrongs them in any way, or rights them in any way. Then they are able to form their opinion and make a judgment on a person. Gortwog also made peace with his former enemy, the Kingdom of Wayrest, and the region endured a lasting peace, at least between those two races. I imagine the Bretons were still fighting amongst themselves, as it is their nature. But good old King Gortwog had finally achieved a lasting peace for his people and a coexistence with the other races of Tamriel. The Orcs actually managed to thrive when they didn't have to deal with the deviously gluttonous and bloated Breton kings or the violently expansionist Redguards. They had finally gained equal footing with the other races, and contributed greatly to the Empire as a whole. For so long, the Orcs embodied what's known as the refugee's spirit, but no longer. Gortwog was definitely a once-in-an-era type of Orc. He truly did raise his race up from the mires. And while Gortwog was one of the most legendary leaders the Orcs have ever had, he still wasn't above making a controversial decision or two, like for example his views on religion. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, Gortwog was one of the proponents of the idea that Malacath had been deceiving them by stringing them along, acting like the story of the Orcish creation was the truth, and was actually just an unrelated demon. Gortwog then decreed that he was bringing the Orcs back into the worship of Trinimac, who he believed was still out there and had actually tricked Boethia into thinking she had corrupted him and turned him into Malacath. Curiously though, he also had statues of Moloch in his Orsinium. Now he could easily be one of the guys who views Moloch and Malacath as separate, or perhaps Gortwog viewed their worship of Malacath as an important part of their past that shouldn't be forgotten. It's honestly tough to say, and no one really knows what his policies were concerning the continued worship of Malacath in his new land. I imagine he was quite lenient because it was a hell of a big change for most of the Orcs to accept. It's currently unknown if his Trinimac doctrine affected his Orsinium in the same way it affected the Orsinium of the Second Era, with all that religious infighting, and perhaps because Gortwog was such a capable leader that he was actually able to maintain and manage all of these religious groups without it spilling over into a war. Whether the same could be said for his descendants remained to be seen though. But for the first time in a long time, it finally looked like the Orcs and their new homeland's future was prosperous. And sure, the Orcs did occasionally revert to their old troublemaking ways. This usually only happened when groups of Orcs would align with groups of Nords and they would get together and cause what's called ruckus. Like when the two races teamed up to try and retake Solstheim for Skyrim, or when they went to Morrowind to attempt to take territory from the Reterans. But little uprisings and shit like that was normal for the Empire, and the Orcs as a whole, as well as Orsinium, was doing fine. But everything changed when the Mythic Dawn attacked, causing the infamous Oblivion crisis, which effectively sent the Empire into chaos. We sort of get conflicting accounts about how the Empire handled it, because in Oblivion, Chancellor Akato says the Imperial Legion is tied up dealing with the Oblivion crisis in all the other provinces, but in Skyrim we're told that the Empire recalled all of its legions to protect Cyrodiil, leaving the provinces to fend for themselves. So that's a whole discussion that could be had in a separate video. But when it comes to the Orcs and the Oblivion crisis, it's very likely that there weren't very many Mythic Dawn members in Orsinium, so I doubt that many Oblivion gates were actually opened in their province. But it's also possible that there were Mythic Dawn agents in High Rock or Hammerfell that opened gates near Orsinium, which forced the Daedra to attack Orsinium from the outside, perhaps laying siege on the kingdom. But as we know about the Orcs, their defenses and fortifications were legendary. I mean, it took 30 years for the combined armies of Hammerfell and High Rock to finally raise the first Orsinium. It seems more than likely that the Orcs would be capable of holding off the Daedra for a couple weeks, or however long the Oblivion crisis lasted for. So I imagine the actual Oblivion crisis itself wasn't too hard on the Orcs or Orsinium as a whole, but it was the aftermath that completely destabilized the Empire. Many of the provinces would feel the effects of the Empire supposedly turning its back on them, and Orsinium would be no exception. Early in the Fourth Era, the Bretons and Redguards would once again seize an opportunity provided by a fractured empire, and sack Orsinium yet again. I imagine by this point Gortwog was either very old or was already gone, and the Orcs were left without their leader to deal with the fallout of once again losing their homeland. Luckily, the Imperials saw the potential in having the Orcs indebted to them, and actually intervened on their behalf, rescuing them from the bloodthirsty Bretons and Redguards, and saving them from total annihilation. Many people have also noted that the Imperials didn't really do much to stop Orsinium from falling, or to reprimand the Bretons and Redguards, or even pursue any kind of aggression against them for their crimes against the Orc. Now that could be because the Empire wasn't in too good of a state, and probably couldn't afford fighting a war against two of its provinces, but it is admirable that they didn't let the Bretons and Redguards pursue a full genocide against Orsinium. I mean, sure, Orcs had already assimilated into the societies of various cultures all around Tamriel, but the idea of an Orcish homeland didn't bother anyone as much as it did the Bretons and Redguards. At the end of the day, the Imperial intervention in this whole conflict could have been handled a little bit better, at least from an Orcish perspective, but from an Imperial perspective it was a win-win. They didn't anger High Rock and Hammerfell, and they got the Orcs, who the Empire itself owed a pretty big debt to for all of the lives it's given the Legion, out of there and in their debt. And the Imperials themselves probably saw the best possible solution as just getting the Orcs out of there and away from the Redguards and Bretons, which is exactly what they did. The Imperials would then bring the Orcs to Cyrodiil and Skyrim, where they likely joined up with the Orcish populations of those provinces. and by the time the Great War with the Aldemari Dominion broke out, the Orcs had fully been integrated into Cyrodiilic and Imperial society. Orcs were even able to serve as vassals under the Empire. We see this with Bloodfall Kingdom that's been ruled by the Orcish Gro-Batul dynasty for over 100 years. Shit, we even saw Orcish lords paving the way for this in Oblivion. Even before becoming effectively a client race of the Imperials, Orcs could be capable of rising up to pretty lofty stations if they set their mind to it. So it's impossible to say how things would have turned out for the Orcs if the Oblivion Crisis didn't have so many terminal side effects for the Empire. Although it is probably pretty safe to say that the large number of Orcs living in Cyrodiil and Skyrim, serving as soldiers or warriors, likely greatly contributed to the Empire's overall survival through the Great War, even if it was in a pretty diminished state. Even with its people so scattered, the idea of a Orcish homeland still lived on, and the city of Orsinium will be rebuilt a fourth time, likely with the help of the Imperials, as 2 whole Imperial legions defend it currently. But the new Orsinium would be in a new location, this time nestled in between the borders of Hammerfell and Skyrim. And we see how the Orcs are doing 200 years into the Fourth Era in Skyrim. We mostly just see stronghold Orcs, but we do learn a lot about them. Stuff like how the Code of Malacath could be interpreted in a number of ways, and that not all rules are set in stone. Some chiefs can bend the rules as they see fit and have no consequences. Other ones, particularly weak chiefs, could lead to their whole tribe having to pay for their own failures, or at least suffer for them. We also see many former legion smiths and soldiers, all occupying their own little corners of Skyrim. The Nords don't seem to have too much of a problem with the Orcs, but they do sort of view the strongholds as an affront to their people. But again, if you ask the Orcs will tell you that they've been there longer than the Nords, so who cares what they say. Shit, by the events of Skyrim, the most famous cook in all of Tamriel is an Orc. I guess it's true what they say that, like, gourmet cooking is the smithing of food. So the Orcs, at least at present in the lore, they're not doing too bad. They've got Orsinium back. They're more accepted by the majority of Tamriel than they've ever been in their existence. But yeah, the Orcs are one of the more admirable and misunderstood races of this entire fictional universe. The origins of their very race is obscure to them, and if the myth is true, they've had their elven lifespans taken from them. They've endured every hardship thrown at them, and still they persist. And sure, all of the races have had their fair share of hardships, but what separates the Orcs from, say, the Dunmer or the Argonians, they didn't overreach and become drunk on their revenge like the Argonians did after Morrowind was destabilized, and they aren't wistfully bitter and longing for a return to how things used to be when they can be the oppressors, like the Dunmer. By the time of the Fourth Era, the Orcs were more scattered across Tamriel than they'd ever been. Orsinium was rebuilt, but a large amount of the Orcish population was still embedded into Cyrodiilic society, while countless clans resided in their strongholds across Skyrim and the other western kingdoms. Gortwog's dream of a wholly united Orcish people seemed very unlikely, maybe even impossible, as due to the diaspora of their race, there were countless wildly different subcultures and subspecies of Orc. For example, there were the Iron Orcs known as the Orsinium, who were wildly reclusive and viciously inbred, to the point where their whole subspecies is considered to be dim-witted by other Orcs. I'm being kinda harsh on them because they are a proud and respectable people. Since they're from the Craglorn area of the Dragontail Mountains, they clashed with the needs of ancient times before setting aside their grievances and living, supposedly, harmoniously. Well, that was before the Yakutans showed up and pretty much genocided the needs. It's notable that the Redguards weren't able to also destroy the Orsinium, as the Iron Orc society still thrives even to this day in the Fourth Era. We already talked about the Wood Orcs of Valenwood and how they'd basically become their own little subculture as well. And even they found a way to peacefully coexist with the nature-loving Wood Elves there. And that's just scratching the surface. The Malak Orcs of Morrowind have their own unique, albeit quite brutal, culture. And city Orcs were as diverse as it gets, especially in Cyrodiil, where you can find Orcish shopkeepers, security trainers, tavern and stable owners. There's even an Orc that founded a knightly order with the protagonist of the game after going on a heroic quest of vengeance. They clearly seem to fit in the most easily in Cyrodiil. But there's even Orcs that live as far as the Shivering Isles, where they just have turned into Scalon hunters. There's one Orc out there in the Isles that's terribly afraid of cats. Although that Orc is still a member of New Sheoth's famous fight club, so even though he's deathly afraid of cats, he's still got that fighting spirit. In Skyrim, the city Orcs have also done quite well. They're extremely prized for their smithing capabilities, and even the Jarl of Markarth's personal smith was an Orc. And as of the Fourth Era, there's only one Orc on Solstheim, and guess what? He's a loan shark who pretty much everybody on the Isle is indebted to. I think that alone is a testament to how far the Orc can come. And obviously the religious beliefs are as diverse as the Orcish people themselves. And even orcs who share the same belief systems might not exactly agree on the specifics of said religion. I imagine a good amount of city orcs worship the imperial divines, but there's also probably going to be several city orcs that still worship Malacath. And those orcs that live in the city and do still worship Malacath aren't exactly going to be the same as, for example, the stronghold orcs. Stronghold orcs are sort of isolationary, and they don't really easily accept help from outsiders, even when in desperate need of it. And how the stronghold orcs treat city orcs sort of varies from tribe to tribe. Some can be quite accepting, while others seem to view city orcs as completely worthless. It seems to vary on a chief-to-chief basis, how a tribe treats its city orcs, and probably depends on whether or not they need more orcs to bolster their numbers or not. I imagine a struggling tribe would be willing to welcome any city orc that happened to show up on their doorstep. Strongholds already have a pretty rigid structure as it is. Only the chieftain is allowed to have wives and procreate. The chief's daughters are generally sent away to other tribes, and generally a dowry is paid to the chieftain by the other tribe. However, understandably so, many orc females choose to leave their strongholds before being sent away to marry some distant chieftain. Some embrace their roles and even grow up looking forward to the day that they'll be sent away to their new home and meet their new chieftain. But a great number choose instead to leave the strongholds and become either smiths or soldiers or mercenaries. There are actually a surprising amount of opportunities for an orc that left their stronghold. Meanwhile, though, chiefs' sons generally form a rival-type relationship with one another, well, until one of them kills their dad in single combat and becomes the new chief, after which point it's kind of unknown what happens to the brother. Some chiefs keep them around to help bolster the strength of the stronghold. Others leave on their own accord to join the legion, or like I said with the females, become mercenaries. They usually aren't allowed to return to their strongholds after they leave, but there are exceptions. Sometimes the return of a chieftain's brother could be viewed as a threat. And I'm sure plenty of orcish chieftains' brothers have showed back up to try and take the stronghold from their brother, but that's not always the case. Sometimes they're welcomed back as family and usually given a role that helps strengthen the tribe and puts their abilities to their best use. Some older stronghold orcs, once they start to feel their body failing them, decide to march out into the wilderness and find a good death. As far as they're concerned, they're too old to be a chief and to take on wives at this age, both wrong and irresponsible, which is actually a pretty admirable thing when you think about it, especially in this sort of setting. I mean, look at Viserys in House of the Dragon. He's literally falling apart and he decides to have more kids that he won't be around to raise. And that's another thing the old orcs mention, is that they go to meet their death when they still have the strength to raise their swords and actually face that death with dignity. They also claim Malacath has granted them a vision of a glorious death, and that I actually kind of believe. That's probably how the average orc is programmed, at least the stronghold ones. One day they wake up and they know it's time. Especially if they, like the old orcs we meet, have led an unfulfilled life. A glorious death is probably the best thing Malacath could offer them, and it's probably the only thing they would want. That's why you don't see too many male, gray-haired stronghold orcs. They don't live that long. The chiefs get killed by their sons, and all the ones who aren't chief march out into the wilderness to go die before they get too old. Old orcish women, on the other hand, are a pretty common sight at strongholds, and generally the chieftain's mom acts as a wise woman. From there, the first of the chieftain's wives is usually the hunter wife, and the other is usually the forge wife. Maybe I'm mixing that order up, but you get the idea of tribal orcish society. And these orcs believe they live life as Malacath intended them to, and maybe they're right. Most city orcs, on the other hand, appear to be pretty chill. They work various real jobs, usually as smiths or store merchant, armed guards. There's even an orcish book merchant in Cyrodiil, though they generally tend to work jobs that involve at least the implication of use of their massive physical stature. For example, the famous bloated float in the slums of Imperial City employed an orcish bouncer. At this point in history, they were viewed as just regular people, just like anybody else. And sure, interbreeding with the other races was generally quite rare for the orcs, usually due to the orcs' perceived ugliness. Though there were some notable exceptions, like for example the Grey Prince, a half-orcish arena champion and the son of an imperial lord who happened to be a vampire that had an affair with his orcish maid. And if that example exists, I'm sure there are other instances of it as well, although it is still quite rare. I also imagine that the orcs of the 4th era Orsinium are quite different than the orcs of the 2nd era Orsinium. And that kind of shows that the orcs as a people are constantly evolving and changing. Basically what I'm saying is orcs were as divided as an entire people as ever, but I think this also resulted in them being more accepted as a whole, as the average orc in the 4th era probably experiences a whole hell of a lot less of prejudice than, say, an orc in the 1st era would, or even an orc in the early years of the 3rd era would. And again, I'm sure there's scores of humans that still distrust the orcs based solely on their looks and their supposed barbarian history, but it's really nothing less than impressive to see just how far the orcs as a species have come, and all the bullshit they had to do just to get there. It is a bit sad that Gortwog's dream of a united Orsinium seems to have died with him, but perhaps that's not what the orcs need right now. Now I know we've been going on for almost an hour at this point, but we got one last thing to cover: orcish death rites. So when an orc dies, they're burned down to ashes, similar to the death rites of the Dunmer. The ashes are then given to the orc's kin, and they're generally used in the forging of weapons or armor for the kin of the fallen orc so that they could have something to remember them by. That's just something I thought was really cool and unique to them, and it reminded me of the whole smoking someone's ashes. They probably do that too. The early orcs of the Rothgarian Mountains used to bury their dead in a mountain called the Sorrow. Basically a mountain turned into one giant mausoleum. It was dotted with various tombs and great monuments to the fallen orcs. The only problem was, to bury their dead in this sacred place, they had to brave the mountains. So funerals and burials generally came at the cost of several orcish lives due to the harsh conditions of the mountains. In fact, it was said that only the strongest orcs were able to survive the trials of the mountain, and those that died along the way were generally left where they fell. It honestly can't get any more orcish than that. I mean, how about that? You go to bury your dead family member only to end up dying along the way and ending up as his company. And to top it off, no one drags your body into one of the various cairns that dotted the Sorrow. Nope, you just got left behind. I mean, I understand why the conditions in the mountains are that bad. You can't just carry a dead body. But holy shit, why would anybody want to make this pilgrimage to bury one of their dead in this honorable place if it costs them so many lives? In fact, at one point it said that 7 whole orcish clans were wiped out in the process of building a tomb and burying the great orcish king Torrig. Sometime after that, they stopped burying their dead in the mountain, and that's when I imagine they began cremating their dead. And when it comes to city orcs, they're probably given the same death rites as whatever culture that they've assimilated into. There's also a handful of orcs that worship other Daedra lords besides Malacath. For example, Azura had a couple of orcish champions lead a group of warriors to go kill a legendary vampire. They succeeded, but they were all infected in the process, so they chose to seal themselves away in this cave for who knows how long. And when they finally got the good death they deserved, Azura put a couple candles up near her shrine for them. I imagine they wound up in her realm of Oblivion after that, but honestly, who knows with Daedra lords. City orcs in Skyrim probably wind up in the various halls of the dead, and in Cyrodiil they were given the same burials as anyone else. Unless they wanted a more ceremonial orcish burn death, I imagine that could be requested and granted to them, if they wanted it. And I think that's all I have to say about that. Oh yeah, one more thing. Fun fact, orc males are actually the fastest race in Morrowind, because for some reason your base speed was tied to your base size, and it wound up shaking out to the biggest races move the fastest, and therefore orc males are the fastest race in Morrowind. Just something I couldn't help but mention. But yeah, I never expected this video to be this long. It really wasn't supposed to turn into a history of the orcs, but it did. These things have a way of taking on a life of their own. But as always, let me know if I missed anything or if I got anything wrong. But yeah, if you liked the video, please like it. If you disliked it, please dislike it. And if you like hearing me ramble on about various video game topics and lore, please consider subscribing. We just cracked 17K, which to me is quite impressive. And that's really just thanks to you guys showing up and watching my videos and being this cool little community that we've become. And we should be back to regularly scheduled programming now. I had some internet trouble the past couple weeks, but that appears to have been sorted out. I've also been working on getting a good amount of footage for Dark Souls 3 videos, so expect those on the horizon, as well as those Fallout videos I keep hyping up. But that's enough rambling like a spaz. Let's have our outro, shall we? Pretty cool mod, right? I can't believe it took as long as it did for it to finally make it onto the Bethesda.net mods. That's something that should have just been in the base game. Anyway, though, I don't know if I'm going to do one of these for every race when it comes to the Elder Scrolls. I might eventually down the road get to all of them. I'm definitely working on something about the Minotaur right now, and there's a bunch of other videos that are like half finished that I'm probably going to get out to before I get to another one of these long ones, but I thought this was a pretty cool topic. I haven't really seen the Orcs covered much, and in my opinion, I think I already said it a couple times, they're probably the most underrated of the playable races in the Elder Scrolls, at least based on their lore and their usefulness. Plus, I just felt like they had a really interesting story, and they really are a misunderstood race. But yeah, at the risk of rambling again, I will let you guys go. Thanks for watching this whole long ramble rant thing. Until next time, be safe and see ya.
The record of history will read, however, the handful of overfed senators in this room will choose to write it. I am not interested in the record of history. I am interested in reality. Dreams don't come pretty. They don't come clean, and they sure as hell don't come simple. They come true. Truth delivered by lies is no less true. And dreams made reality by falsehood are no less real. That is what I delivered. Announcing to the world with its piercing scream that we are a great people who can accomplish great things. Yet, here I sit, elected by you to play my part. The part of the scapegoat. The patsy sent into the wilderness so that men sitting in this room can lay their sins upon my back and claim they themselves are clean. Men enjoying immunity while enriching themselves on the backs of those who sacrificed everything to make manifest. Blood has been spilled. Lives have been lost. Men have been ruined. I saw it, and I survived. I will not return from the wild, only to have 6 bureaucrats in starched collars judge the manner in which I realized that dream. Put me on trial. Lock me in prison. Erase me from the record. For history is written in pencil. And the truth is carved in steel across this nation.
Why do you bother me? Go away! Get lost or I'll pull your arm off.